Okay, can you hear me now? Oh, hold on. Now can you hear me? She can't hear me at all.
It shows you that there is one of those.
Okay, just give me 1 second. Fantastic. So thank you very much. I apologize for the technical glitches. Who knows what it is at the end of the day, but I'm so happy to talk to you a little bit about the Villae Magnificae, the hidden treasures of Pompeii. And when I was asked to put this presentation together, you know, I was really struggling. What houses do I look at, for instance? And so I took my inspiration from stage 1 from our book. And here we have a typical plan of a Pompeiian house. And what really struck me about this was it said of a Pompeiian house, not the Pompeiian house, because one of the things that always strikes us when we take our students is how different all of these houses actually are. No two houses have exactly the same floor plan. You could be right beside your neighbor and they have a completely different layout to their house than the person across the street or the person across the road or literally across the other side of the city. And so one of the things that I wanted to point out, and please bear with me because there's a point to this and maybe your kids will find it interesting. I'm hoping you can see my cursor because right there where we have, of course, the Culina and the Latrina, I'd like to point out to us as we work our way through Pompeii. So you know, when you ask people about, have you been to Pompeii? Have you been to any of the wonderful houses in Pompeii? Oftentimes they will mention, of course, the House of the Vettii or the House of the Dancing Faun, or perhaps the Villa of the Mysteries, or my favorite house on the planet, which is the House of Cubicula that you see here on the right side. But then I thought, okay, well, we can't possibly look at all of these houses from the city. So I thought what we do, if it's all right with you, is just kind of concentrate on this section right here. It's just adjacent to the entertainment district. Of course, it has a very famous house right here, the House of Mansander. And so I thought, instead of looking specifically at the House of Mansander, I thought we'd look at a couple of other ones that have open capacity to the public.
How's it going?
So, if we can, I thought we'd start at the newest house to open. And why is this so important? Well, this is the House of the Lovers. Now, don't confuse it with Castiamanti. It's not the Castiamanti. This is actually the only two-story house we have in Pompeii. It's just been open from restoration for many, many years, and it's very small. You'll find it tucked away at the back of the block in which we find the House of Mansander. And one of the reasons why I like this house is, number one, we never see two-story houses in Pompeii. We have to go to Herculaneum for that. But there's a very lovely, two things actually. There's a lovely garden attached to it, as well as a little graffito that I think you'll find.
Do you need a hand with that?
So if you look here, you'll see this is the House of Mansander. Originally, they think that all of this would have been part of the House of Mansander, including C. And if you're looking for a fantastic site for your kids, by the way, to point them in the direction of information about Pompeii, if you go down here to Google Sites Pompeii, it's phenomenal. It has lots of pictures, it has information, it will give you all sorts of layouts and designs. And what's really important about it is that it is approved by the Beni Culturali in Italy. So you know that it's got the stamp of approval. And what I thought we'd do is we kind of look right here at C, because that's the House of the Lovers. And if you look here, you'll notice that 10 is F. They actually owned and ran this little establishment. We don't know exactly what they sold there, but this little store, this little shop was theirs. And if you look at the layout of the house, you'll notice that it's a little different because it doesn't have balance on this side of the house versus over here. And this is the wall that it shares with Mansander. So when you enter, one of the things that strikes you, of course, is the beautiful depth of the Trinibar on the wall. And of course, the Crytoportico floor, which is phenomenal. And it's just got a lovely, lovely, well intact little impluvium. But what I want to point out is right here, this little walkway, because this is going to take us both to the kitchen. It's going to show us where the upper story is, and it's going to take us to this little graffito I was talking about. So here we go. If we walk down this part of the peristelium, The garden is spectacular. You can see that just here is an opening. That's the kitchen door. And if I could point out this little opening right here, very sadly, the house was broken into. And so there are a series of holes dug through the walls as people had made their way through plundering and looting and taking all sorts of things. But what's really interesting is if you look at the very back, what you'll see is the portico, which leads to the stairs. That is the latrina right there. But more importantly, it's this beautiful little fresco, this little tiny vignette that you see right across from the kitchen of a duck. And it has Roman cursive, and the Roman cursive says, amantes ut apes vitam melitam exigunt. So lovers like bees live a sweet life, which is kind of a nice way. This house is just, you know, it's so small and it's so delicate, and it just seems to fit with this particular statement. And then, there we go. Something is happening here. My screen has frozen. There we are. This is their beautiful triclinium that looks out onto that little garden. And what strikes you immediately is the depth of the color of the ochre on the walls and the blue. This is going to be a theme for this particular presentation because, of course, it comes from lapis lazuli, so this would have been very expensive. The owner of this house must have had a fairly decent income to be able to afford that. But more importantly, look up at the ceiling, because rarely do we see ceilings in these houses. And apparently, this is all the plaster that had fallen from the ceiling and has been replaced. And I said to my tour guide when I said, well, why is it arched? Why isn't it flat? And the tour guide said that it would be the shape of the plaster that they found that dictated the shape of the ceiling. And I thought that was a pretty cool answer, because how often do you see ceilings? And that begs the question then when the kids ask me, well, how much decoration was in the house? Well, floor, walls, ceiling. So everywhere you looked, you would constantly, you know, be exhausted by looking all around the room and taking in all of the decoration. But this is what really struck me, and this is what I wanted you to really look at. If you look very carefully at this wall, you can see the plaster on top of a very rough background, because after the earthquake of 62-63, the wall was damaged and they replaced it with broken pottery. So I put right here, if you can see it, that's the bits of broken pottery that were used to, you know, shore up the wall, and then they replastered over top of it. This is one of my favorite places. So when we come out of the House of the Lovers and we turn right and right again, it brings us to this street right here. And this is the street in front of the House of Mansander. Why this is important? Well, if we continue going straight in this direction, we'll come out to the theaters. This is the House of Gillis, and this is the Crytoportico right here. It's about 3 feet that you have to go up these stairs into the back of the house. You're literally entering the house through the back of the house. But it is a really nice place to go in Pompeii when the temperature is between 40 and 45 degrees, because you're going to get to go underground. And what's really interesting is this is the floor plan right here of the Crytoportico. So you can see that it's a very, very long house. In fact, archaeologists suggest that maybe even this and possibly even this were part of it originally, but this house was subdivided. And one of the interesting things about it is that it had a beautiful bath complex. But for whatever reason, they decided to shut the bath complex down and use the rooms for storage. And so if you take a look here, we enter here, we're going to go this way and this way, then up some stairs to the upper level. And one of the reasons I picked this particular area of Pompeii is because the houses fit the hill. Because Pompeii was, of course, an extinct volcano. And so the hill kind of curved, and they make their houses then fit the topography of the city. So here we are, here we're going to enter the Crytoportico. All right, so when you walk in, you have to go down a ramp downstairs. So all of this that you see at the top has been replaced. This is all part of the restoration. And it was blocked off right here in antiquity when they had shut down the bath complex. And perhaps part of that was because of damage done by the earthquake. Nobody really can give you an answer. But what's really cool about it is you have this beautiful purple on the walls, almost the color of porphyry. And of course, if you look along the baseboard that you have here, you'll see it almost looks three-dimensional. So if you take a look straight on, they're trying to give you that sense of three-dimensionality, which is very, very neat. But what I really wanted to point out to you was this picture right here. This is an actual graffito made by a Roman child. And one of the really poignant elements of this house is to think that there were 18 people, 18 adults, 8 children that were found here when they excavated the house at the turn of the 20th century. And so it's really sad to think is perhaps that this is one of the last drawings that maybe a child had made before the eruption had overtaken them. If we continue then along the hallway, you'll see that we have this arch again, but what is really striking is this beautiful plaster work. And it puts me in mind of the plaster ceiling that you see at the Stadium Baths. So the people who owned this property had a great deal of money. There's no question about it, because those are all individual panels that are affixed to the ceiling. And you'd have to do that in order to hit the arch, which would make this a particularly important place for people who are trying to shelter. And this is just, again, walking down the hall. These are stairs leading you up to the next level. So we've gone from downstairs where the bath complex would have been back upstairs. And if you take a look as we walk to the end of the hall, you'll notice that they have a lot of amphorae because this was used, of course, to store a lot of things. All right. One of the things that always strikes me too is that these rooms were shut off. They weren't used anymore, but look at the beautiful decoration that you find here and the colors, the depth of the colors that you see in a lot of other houses because the humidity and the exposure to light kind of dulls them. And presumably here, there was something in the middle of the floor that they cut out, but this is all a mosaic floor. And so as you're going upstairs to the upper part of the house, where you're going to walk up the hill, essentially toward the Via della Bondanza, you look down into these rooms. And over here, you can see we're just making our way toward the Via della Bondanza. This is what I wanted to show you. This is a summer triclinium. If you look at the color of the Trinibar, it is extraordinary. And the condition of this room is extraordinary. So here, this is what strikes me. Here are the benches on which people would have reclined to have their dinner. And of course, you notice that right in front, there's this low ledge right here. So Mary Beard says this is where you put your drink, your drink of wine. There is a table, but it's kind of set back a little far. So how would the people who were reclining on these sides of the couch actually access that? That's an interesting question for your kids to consider. This wall here is too high for people to enjoy the little garden that's outside, which is an interesting choice because you'd think that they would want to look outside. And here is this part right here is just a little stove where they might have prepared food or kept it warm while they were serving the guests here. And then when you come through, you come down a set of stairs again, and you see that there is a new atrium that has been created for this house. There's the impluvium here. And what they've done is a Tuscan style of atrium that has these 4 columns to support the new roof. And when you swing around, you will see this. And every time I see this picture, I think of stage 6 and the Awaris story, the miser, who's so happy with his serpens because the serpens protects their money, that he keeps in his strong box. And I wonder if in fact that might have been in this house. And of course, there's the god Mercury right there because he would be the patron deity for merchants. So it makes sense that maybe this man was the merchant. One thing I do want to point out though, if you look at the bottom, just under the snake, you'll see that black band right here. We have a similar such painting in the House of Cubicula and others as well. So going through my mind as I'm talking to the kids about this, I wonder if sometimes, this is kind of like a style we have, you go and pick this kind of border for wallpaper or this kind of paint finish. And I wonder if this was the same thing that had gone through the minds of people who lived in Pompeii at this time. We continue along and we go out then to the Via della Bondanza and we're going to swing right. And we're not going to take this little road. We're going to take the next little road. And that's going to bring us to the House of the Afib. and one of my very, very favorite houses to visit because it's so neat. There are 5 houses which have kind of been compressed into one, and you can see that they're going through the process of adding in these houses and changing the architecture just before the eruption of Vesuvius. Some people suggest that it might have been the house of Cornelius Tages because there is a little inscription down the road. I don't know, but they do call it the House of the Afib because of this gorgeous bronze statue that was found there, and it is currently on exhibition in the antiquarium in the site itself. So if you have a chance to go to Pompeii, don't miss the antiquarium. Here, just like outside the House of Chias, just like outside the Crytoportico, you have then these little benches that were set aside for the clients or anyone who was coming really to have business with the master inside the house and had to wait outside the house. This is again the main entrance. There was one here, there was one here. Originally, they think that this house had been divided into 3 smaller ones because we're going to look at the entrances of how they change. This diagram has D and E separate, but actually D and E are all one house. They've been joined together. And it reminds me of the house of Caecilius because he had the south house and he had the north house joined together by 2 doors. The same thing here. And one of the things that I want to point out is the kitchen, which is right over here, and this beautiful Veridarium that you see. Okay. So here we've entered into the main door. So we're in the atrium. Unfortunately, there isn't a definitive impluvium like we would expect to see. The house seems to have shifted where those things would have been when they took out a wall. And you have this really weirdly placed wall here, likely because as they were remodeling the house, they still needed it for support of the roof. But here is the very first entrance to the first house. Clearly, it was all walled up. That's all stone. But this is really cool because this is the plaster cast of the door that was in the house. And you can see that it had this stick right here, this wooden beam that was holding it closed. So did they cover over the wood with plaster stucco? Did they just leave it like this? The archaeologists can't tell you that, but they found it, the door being permanently closed. And if we continue along, we have these lovely little cubicula that you see here. And they have these vignettes of very delicately painted animals. This one, the griffin here. You see symbols for Jupiter here, fish here. What I wanted to point out to you was this, which is right here. This is an obsidian glass mirror. And the allays who are in the house take very great care to make sure that you pay attention to the obsidian glass mirror because there are only a couple of houses in Pompeii that have them. And apparently it shows that they had a great deal of money. And if you're going to combine 5 houses together, I imagine you must have a great deal of money. So if we walk down this way, we're going to enter into the main part of the house and that Veridarium that I wanted to take you to. So this is the kitchen. Yet again, for 5 houses, this is a very small kitchen. In fact, 2 people would find it very difficult to cook here. So there was only one cook, presumably. And there is our stove, and there is our latrina. So this would be an interesting conversation for you to have with the kids. Why would that be? And what does that mean? And how is that different from modern houses? And how does our understanding of what is a domestic area versus a non-domestic area like? If we whip around the corner, then we come to this beautiful, it could have been a triclinium because if you look at the floor, the layout of the floor, which is done in a beautiful little mosaic, right, spells out that there could have been 3 couches there with a table in the center, or it could have been a very, very lovely tablinium as well. The whole house is decorated using these white backgrounds and the 4th style with these little tiny vignettes. This is what I wanted to show you, however. This is a biclinium. I didn't even know they had biclinia until I came to this house. So you can see then what they would have had, how they would have put their house out, or rather the biclinium out in that part of the house because of the floor. That floor, that opus sectile floor like that, you're going to see replicated in Herculaneum. There are very few other houses in Pompeii that have such a beautiful intact floor. But what I really wanted to point out to you, other than the beautiful little angel images that you see floating on the walls, is this right here. There's another vivarium and there is another snake. So it brings me back to that story in stage 6. And then of course you can't cross over because they have that little balustrade, so you're not allowed to walk on that floor. And it's very hard now for my friend who is a tour guide says it's very hard for you to pour water on the floor and pretend like it was rain so that you could see the color of the marble when it doesn't have all the dust on top. What I want to point out is this wall right here, because we're going to swing around that wall and come right here. There is another Liberarium. And it's tucked in the corner. And then for whatever reason, they built this wall in front of it so that it could host this fresco of Venus and Mars. And again, there's a lot of blue. This house has a lot of blue in it. And you'll notice that we're on a very high level here, and we're going to have to walk down into the Veridarium. It might have been excavated, or this just might have been the proper angle of the hill down. I suspect it's the proper angle of the hill. And what you do is you come to this lovely outdoor triclinium, this summer triclinium. There may have been a roof over it, like a very light vine roof. This now has plexiglass to protect it from the rain and the sunlight in particular. And the whole bench area is covered with plexiglass as well. The reason being that they wanted to keep as much of the rain, as much of contact by visitors who get really close to this as possible away from it. The only problem is that when the plexiglass is there for a considerable amount of time, it needs cleaning because it picks up a lot of the grime from the atmosphere. So what you have at the very back then is this lovely little fountain. And when the fountain poured water into this basin right here and the basin became full, the basin emptied, and there's a trench between the two benches so that it brings water down between the benches toward this fountain that's in the center. So your recliners then, your diners are going to recline, they'll put the drinks in front of them, and hopefully there was something there like a cushion or what have you to prevent them from lying straight on the cement surface as you have it. This is what I really love. If you notice in the center, there's a fountain. And so my friend who is the tour guide said, you know, when the water pushes into the air, what happens then is as the heat comes in to make that evaporate, the use of that heat, the energy from that heat actually makes it feel colder, which would explain splash pads in the summer, absolutely. But here you have this beautiful, what they call Nilotic scenes, scenes of the Nile, all done in blues. So it would be very calming. You can hear the water rippling through, it would be very cool. And then I just wanted to take us around to this to show you as much blue as remains. Sadly, this has been exposed to the atmosphere a little bit, and it's very difficult to conserve once the plaster and the paint began to come off. But right beside this, right over here, you will see this stairway leading to the bottom houses. And it's about a 5-foot drop. So again, we're going down into some new houses. And what you see here is, of course, there's a stairway on the opposite side, and there are some rooms here. And if we turn, there is another little garden. What's really interesting about these columns, the bottom part is Trinibar, the top is the ochre color. This side is very dark, the other side is very light because it's been bleached by the sun. And of course, if you continue around this way, you'll see another Liberarium. And immediately on the right is the summer triclinium. It was undergoing some kind of renovation because all that's there now is a big pile of dirt. So it looked like they were trying to redo something before the eruption overtook the house. Then we come back to this side as we continue along. So we've gone down, we're working our way back toward the House of Mansander. We enter another atrium, and there we have a tablinium. What they've done is they've cut a window in this tablinium so it looks out into a garden. And every time I try to get close to see if I can see what's in that garden, there's usually one of the allies there to remind me that there is, you know, a barrier there for a reason. But I really just want to see what's on the other side. If you've had a chance to go to a Plantes, they have rooms that have windows cut into them like that as well. And if we continue along, we are in yet another atrium. And this time, our room that we see right here actually has a little bit of a plaster door. So this must have been the door that he could use, whoever owned this house previously, to shield then his tablinium from prying eyes. And if we go out this way, we are right back to the Crytoportico, the House of Mansander, the House of Chia. So we've literally just gone in a circle. But if you'll bear with me, I'd like to take you to the Praedia of Julia Felix. This is one of the most amazing houses. And why? A, its size. B, I love it because, of course, it belonged to a woman. And it's not that women wouldn't have been wealthy. I mean, look at Eumacia. She built that huge complex for the cloth merchants. But the Praedia of Julia Felix is just that much more impressive because of the nature of the artwork that you see and the scale of this house. And so when you approach the house now, you have to approach either from the Via della Bondanza or you have to come in from the Colosseum. And sometimes they switch the direction of traffic because you're not allowed to walk through the entirety of the house. They actually have you walking on a raised platform so that you're not doing any damage to the flooring. And you come through this garden, which is, I can't imagine what it would be like to have a huge pool like that in a garden with all sorts of statues and what have you. But what's really impressive, and I've never seen this in any other house, but I'm hoping other people will have seen other architecture and be able to tell me if this existed elsewhere. These beautiful rectangular columns, right? They're a variation of an Ionic Corinthian column combination. And here, as you're walking through this palaestra, or this rather portico, we're going to go to her bath complex. Now, Julia Felix may have been a Liberta, and that opens up a very interesting question that you can ask your students. Could a Liberta, how could a Liberta afford this much property in the city of Pompeii, if that is true? I have yet to be able to confirm that. One of the professors that I know who was in the site said that maybe the name Felix might indicate that she was a Liberta. So I'm putting that out there with, you know, some great caution for you. But if you take a look at number 1, number 2, and number 3 in the depiction on the left-hand side, they're all the same size. And if you look at number 4, it's twice. And what happened was she bought that entire block. She took the road out, rebuilt her house, and then on the other side, between 4 and 5, she had the road extended so that people would have an unimpeded way to get from the edge of her property, from the Via della Bondanza, all the way to the arena. And there you see number 6 is the arena. But one of the other things that is really neat in stage, stage 11, when we're looking at the candidates, we look at this picture talking about a candidate and how he's going to go about polling for his own to be elected. And here, this little fresco came from the House of Julia Felix. So you have a lot of opportunities to use this house as part of a conversation. But what's even nicer about that is that she opened her bath complex. So this is presumably after the earthquake, when maybe the bath complexes weren't open to the public as much as they might have been. She opened the bath complex up to people who could afford it. So this was like a spa extraordinaire, if you will. And so what I'd like to do is take you on just a little tour of her house till we get to the bath complex, if you'll bear with me for a second. So we're back then to this little portico right here. And where this lady is standing, you will see one of the most spectacular little triclinia. And it puts me in mind, for anybody who's been to Tivoli to see Hadrian's house there, it puts me in mind of his dining room in the Canopus, because if you look at this, there's the waterfall, there's the beds for the people who would have come to dinner to enjoy a view of her garden. And again, the water comes down this way, and then there's the trench to take it away. So this notion of running water and having water present when you're dining, this seems to be a very big theme for the Romans. And you can't see it too well, but over on the right-hand side, you'll see just a little bit of a blue fresco. And the belief is that this whole room was done in a frieze that would have looked at the Nile, and it would have been done in blue. So it would have been very, very calming and very relaxing. Again, very much like the Canopus. But here's the difference. There's about 100 years between when her house was covered over with the material from Vesuvius and when he would have built the Canopus. So this is the bath complex. And we've seen bathhouses before, but I just want to take you through on a little tour because I want to show you something that you could use with your students if you wished. And that would be The way in which it's laid out is a very small bath complex, but it very much mirrors what you would see at the Stabian baths, what would have been at the central baths if they had been finished, what you can see at the suburban baths. And if you move into this room from the warm room, you will see a caldarium. And this has an excellent example of what the walls could have been like in those bath complexes to draw the heat from the hypocaust up the walls to heat the caldarium. And you can see here on the floor then, those beautiful tiles that would have shielded your feet from the heat of the floor. This would have been the little palaestra, and off of this, we can't see it because unfortunately you're not allowed to go there, it's off limits, but there was a very large swimming pool, not nearly as large as what you would see at Oplantes, but a very significantly sized external swimming pool. So the people who would have come here then would have paid a premium to be able to enjoy such a nice small bathhouse. And right next to her house is this little vineyard. Today they have replanted with grapes that they believe would have been used or very similar to the ones that would have been used in ancient times. And they harvest them every fall. They send them off to Mastro Berardino, and he turns them into Villae di Misteri wine, about 600 bottles, which are sold under that label per year. All right, if you would indulge me, and I don't want to talk too long because I don't want to make this seem like a travel log. Oh, I went to Pompeii and here are my pictures. But I just want to show you this wonderful little house at Boscoriale. I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to go. If you haven't and you're going to Pompeii and you're traveling with your students, please take them to see this house. It has just recently been opened after many years of restoration. It's only about 3 kilometers north of Pompeii. You can easily get there on the Circumvesuviana. It's a 5-minute drive on the Circumvesuviana, and it's about 500 meters from the Circumvesuviana to the site itself, but it is well worth it. And what I'd like to do is contrast what we see as a Villae Urbanae, and I'd like to compare it to a Villa Rustica, which you see here. And the reason is, if you would just indulge me for 1 second, over here we have Misenum, there's Vesuvius, there's Pompeii, there's Boscoriale. If you look at the nature of the curve right here, which has kind of been obliterated, this whole shoreline has been changed as a result of the amount of material that came from Vesuvius. That's why things are much more inland. And I asked my kids about that. How would that change then if these places were very close to the water? And the reason I would really like you to have a chance to take your kids to Boscoriale is because when we start stage 2, we have this lovely room, this lovely cubiculum, which it comes from Publius Venanius Sinistor's house, right? And we say, oh, this is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And it just so happens to have come from Boscoriale, from here. This has recently been opened to the public. It is worth the trip, let me tell you. Because you see this lone little house sitting down, covered with the material from Vesuvius all the way around it. And what you see here, this is a public housing complex. So you drive in amongst all of these public houses, and then here you see this little Roman farm, essentially. So you have that juxtaposition of ancient and modern. What's really neat is how the house itself would have been, I think, an upscale farm. I think you'll agree with me. So you have to walk around the site, and you're literally going down a ramp from modern to Roman. This is the house. And one of the things that I would really love to point out to you is the fact that this stone wasn't left exposed. They actually covered it with a fresco. So it was painted, it was decorated on the exterior. So surely this must have belonged to someone who had a little bit of money to be able to do that. Also, it would have sealed the stone and prevented a lot of the erosion that we see. And you can tell that they've put on there a new layer. You can see it right here, put the roof on. This is what struck me the very first time I took my students here, and it was entirely by accident. We had missed our time, our appointment time to get into Oplantes, and our bus driver thought that this would be a place that we would find very interesting, and boy, was he right. Holy smokes. How strong were the winds coming from Vesuvius, right, when we have those surges, to bend a pine tree, a pine sapling? like this. This is a plaster cast of a pine tree that was bent over by the wind. So if you think about that for just a second, it puts the power of that eruption kind of into perspective. This is just in front of the front door of the house. And here we have the front door. You can see plaster casts of the wooden doors that had blocked, the house when they wanted to close them, although I don't think that was very often, to be honest with you. This is my friend Susanna, who takes me on a lot of tours when I'm lucky enough to go to Pompeii. And she's 6 foot tall, so I thought I would just include this picture so you could get a sense of it's a big house, but in terms of height that we've seen, it's not so large. And when we walk here to this big opening, we come into a wine press because this particular farm produces wine, lots and lots of wine. So the opening you see at the back of the window, that's where they put the grapes in the house. And that's then where they would press them, and it would go down into this subterranean cavern, and it would sit there, and they would allow then, I guess, the wine and the material to silt so they could strain the wine off. And this is what Susanna was looking at. Here you have, this would have been the Poutine that you would have put at the top of where your cistern would have been, so you could draw your water out. And what was really neat, I didn't know that they had lids. I guess that makes sense. I mean, you wouldn't want things to be thrown in there, or God forbid, someone to fall into there. So we had a lid on top of it. Makes perfect sense. And then you see a plaster cast of a little pig right beside it, right? A very small pig. And the tour guide who was at the house at the time when Susanna and I went said that frequently they would allow domestic pigs to run wild, like, without any kind of barrier, so that they would oftentimes mate with wild boars. And apparently, and I apologize to all of those of you who are vegetarian, but apparently when they had a genetic intermingling, if you will, between a domestic pig and then the wild boar, it produced a much nicer animal for eating. And then they made their own bread in their own house because there is the oven in the kitchen. This is what I really wanted to show you. This is what I was able to peek through and see when I took my students the very first time. These are all Dolia set into what would have been the atrium. And each one of these Dolia had little bits of wine residue. And so one of the things that Sophie Hay, for instance, who's done a little bit of work on looking at the dating for the eruption of Vesuvius, she suggests that perhaps the fact that there was wine present in these Dolia means that maybe the eruption didn't happen in August of 79 because perhaps since they only did pressings in the fall, it might have been a little bit later. And I'm standing right in front to take this picture, right in front of the little Veridarium, which had been painted. It's just a very elegant house. This is the triclinium, again, beautifully painted, just like the house that we had just seen in Pompeii, the Crytoportico, for instance, and also the House of the Lovers. And then this is the stable. So you come all the way around. So presumably people lived in the area up above, perhaps, where they had kept the animals. So here, this would have been the stable area. The hay would have gone on top. You can see the openings right here where the wooden beams would have been. And then this was your chicken yard. And this is a Villa Rustica. If you have an opportunity to visit the antiquarium, you'll find all sorts of really neat things inside, like fish hooks and nets and garum, little rope horseshoes, things that you don't see in the National Museum. So it is very much a worthwhile trip to take your kids to see if you happen to travel there. All right, this isn't a typical house, but I thought I would throw this in because this pertains to stage 8. This is the tomb of Gaius Nestorius Priscus. He died at roughly age 22, just before the eruption. And he is a neighbor of Caecilius's. So I guess in a way, this is an eternal house. But what's really interesting is, if you'll bear with me, this is where his ashes would be right here. And then he had inside this beautiful painted, area, this room. I wonder if this was kind of like his Last Supper. You can see this beautifully laid table right here. Sadly, unfortunately, you have a lot of damage done to the faces of the individuals who are at a banquet with Pistorius. But what's really interesting, and I want to show you this here, is this. This is in our book in stage 8. I did not know that. When I went into this little tomb, I had an opportunity to sneak in there for just a few minutes. This is the picture from our book. And what's really interesting, okay, look at this. If you take a look at the gladiator right here, he's wearing braccae because he's got like pantaloons. These are designs on his pants, right? They're different color than his skin. So he's wearing an arm covering here, and then he's wearing pants, and you can see the greaves, and you can see that the fellow who has fallen. And just to point out the scale of this, I always thought it was a little picture. It's not, because this man is 6 feet tall. So I thought this might be something interesting that you could point out to your kids in the book, that this is actually taken from the tomb of a young man who never really had an opportunity to see where his path could have taken him in life. And if you would permit me, and it's been all over the news, so how could I take you to Pompeii and not take you to Caecilius's other neighbor, who is Leda and the Swan? And for years and years and years, when I would walk up toward this tomb, this whole hill that you see right here was covered over in growth and brambles and all sorts of things. And I had no clue whatsoever that there could potentially be houses back there. There's at least one, if not more. And you can see that this door has been, walled up. So presumably this house then has been combined with another house. And when you walk just by this, and these walls are tantalizing, right? Like there's more there. I want to know what's underneath. I know I'll never know what's underneath, but I would really like to know what's underneath. You come to the house of Leda and the Swan, and there's only just a little piece of it which is actually visible to the public. And I haven't got a picture here, but I will point out that there is a picture of Priapus on the opposite wall that you can see right here where the stone would be. That is exactly like the picture you will find in the House of the Vettii. So again, I wonder if people, were choosing their decorations based on things which were popular in the city at that time. And finally, again, if you would allow me, I have never had an opportunity to walk down the little street behind the house of Caecilius. And this year I got an opportunity to walk into some of the new houses which are under excavation and which have made the news. So here, in order to access them, you have to walk behind Caecilius's house, which is right there. And then you turn right and you continue along. So you don't make it to the house of the Silver Wedding quite. You're walking down this really narrow street. And you know what? It's only about 60 meters from Caecilius's house. And I wonder, this is just one of my things. Do you think Grumio might have deked out his posticum in his kitchen when he didn't have any good supper ideas and maybe go to this little thermopolium and buy things? Because they found duck and pork inside the Dolia in this little thermopolium here. It's beautiful. The colors are so bright. And what they've done is they built a little house around it with big windows so that you can have an opportunity to look inside the shop. The sad part is I think that the glass is not going to be able to keep out the rays of the sun and protect it from fading under the strong Italian sunlight. And it's different from all of the other thermopolia because it's not covered in little bits and pieces of marble. It's actually painted. As you continue along down the road, you come to the House of Orion. And what struck me when I walked through the door was the wall decoration, which looks exactly like the House of the Samnite when you go to Herculaneum, and also looks exactly like what you find in the house of the Dancing Faun when you go through the main doorway. But this is what's really cool. There it is. This is Orion and his apotheosis. It's all done in this fantastic little mosaic. It could have been a triclinium, it could have been a tablinium. We don't really know yet. The house is still under excavation, so you can only go in at the end of the day when the restorers have finished and you have someone who's very carefully watching that you don't step where you shouldn't or touch what you shouldn't. When you come out of the House of Orion, you go a little ways down the road and on the left. So here we see, this reminds me of the top of the House of Caecilius. And so I'm thinking that maybe this is what it must have looked like when it was in its full glory. And when you walk through this doorway, you enter an atrium. And you think, okay, interesting. We've gone through the falcons and there's an atrium there. But there's a little tiny, tiny inscription written in cursive on the wall. And I wondered, like, why would somebody write that there? Nonetheless, this is one of the other reasons why the dating is being questioned, because you can clearly see right here the word Nov, right, for November. And so there are a lot of people right now that are speculating that based on a lot of different evidence, most specifically coming from pomegranates, and Sophie Hay says that that's probably our very best source, pomegranates, which wouldn't have existed until mid-fall. One of the reasons why she thinks that maybe Tacitus might have made an error. She's not so sure that this is exact, but the fact that you have this little graffito and it's very, very small on the wall is another one of those tantalizing bits of trying to unravel the story of what happened in 79 CE. And this picture of the lady that you see there could very well be a vignette of the owner of this house. It's absolutely spectacular. So I'm hoping that you haven't found my very brief travel through Pompeii too much of a time waster for you this evening. I hope you have something that you could take away and use with your students. Maybe to supplement those things which we see in our textbook, maybe to give you some questions that you can put forward to the kids. But if nothing else, hopefully I've convinced you that as soon as you can possibly do it, make a trip to Pompeii, take some time to walk through those amazing streets and convene with the people who at one point inhabited this city, because their spirit is very much there. Thank you so much.
Margaret-Anne, thank you so very, very much. Your pictures are absolutely amazing, and the commentary that you shared with us is even more spectacular. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording right now, but I would welcome all of you participating this evening to please unmute yourselves and feel free to ask Margaret-Anne some questions.
I would love it.